9. Authority. Chalcedon Report number 79, March 1st, 1972. One of the persistent problems facing the state in every age has been the question of authority. How can the state justify its claim to power over the people? By what right does the state claim its jurisdiction and its authority? The basic argument has usually been historical, an appeal to tradition, inheritance, and long possession. Kings have justified their rule by appealing to the fact that they inherited the throne, all the while conveniently forgetting that someone in their family's past once seized the throne. Similarly, civil governments which once gained power by revolution piously condemn all new revolutions and declare that they are the only legitimate authority. A painfully pathetic example of this tired argument appears in Vine Deloria Jr., An Indian's Plea to the Churches, Los Angeles Times, February 6, 1972, page GL2. Deloria, an Indian, says to white Americans that, before their coming, "We inhabited and owned the continent upon which you now live." The heart of his argument is that the Indian has a prior right to America and thus a moral claim against the rest of us. The fact is that there were no such, quote, people, end quote, as, quote, the American Indian, end quote, prior to Columbus, but many warring peoples, often culturally and perhaps racially diverse, each supplanting others before them and seeking ascendancy over one another. Shall we acknowledge the Indian's, quote, right, end quote, to America? And must then the Indian relinquish it to a tribe which can prove it was the original displaced owner of America? Shall we say also that England must be dispossessed of all who are of Norman blood and return to the Anglo-Saxons? Must the Anglo-Saxons return it to the Britons, and the Britons to those whom they displaced? And must France be returned to the Celts, or Gauls, Galatians, in its midst, and they in turn restore it to the Basques whom they displaced? The historical argument leads to moral insanity. The authority of a state cannot depend on an original historical claim, although possession has an element of authority to it. Another answer to the problem of authority is the democratic one. It was raised in an English rebellion of 1381, when the popular cry was, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" Authority rests in the people, supposedly, and the only moral ground of authority is the will of the people in this view. In effect, the voice of the people is the voice of God. This view again breaks down in practice. Must the civil government be changed or overthrown whenever the people change their mind? Is man, any more than the state, the source of authority? This is the heart of the issue. Is authority derived from man, from history, from the state, or from tradition? Or is it derived from God? On the other hand, is it derived from force? Very clearly, force and the states are inseparable. The state has the power of the sword, the power of coercion, and it can compel men and take life. Is its only authority simply power, naked force? More than a few people have held this to be the case. Some of these have been radical statists, and others anarchists. In either case, the state is not much more than a gangster who rules with a gun in his hand and only by force. This is a view which appeals most to the intellectually simple-minded and morally derelict. It denies that the governing force in history is moral and religious. Men allow power to that which, rightly or wrongly, they hold to be morally legitimate and right. When men ceased to believe in kings as a repository of divine right and authority, then kings quickly gave way to, quote, the people, end quote, as a source of right. Today, quote, the democratic state, end quote, as moral authority in the eyes of the people, and they will endure more at its hands than men earlier endured from kings. Men at one time believed in the, quote, king's touch, end quote, the healing power of the king. This faith was mild compared to the faith of contemporary man in the power of the state. The state is looked to for every kind of answer, the solution to problems of poverty, health, war, natural disasters, and even death itself is supposedly going to be overcome by the state's power to apply science and solutions to every realm. Recently, someone in California filed suit against the federal government for damages in the 1971 earthquake. The state has become God for modern man, and therefore the state is responsible and accountable for all things. Perhaps someone will next accuse the state because natural death overcomes man. The state is powerful today because the state has a religious and moral force in the lives of people. The, quote, common man, end quote, has not heard of Hegel, but he is a Hegelian, and the state is, for him, a god walking on the earth, whose duty it is to provide him with cradle-to-grave security. A state senator from a very conservative district recently told me that, in answer to a questionnaire geared to revealing the implicit socialism and statism of people, 75% of the people in his district were shown to be statists to the core, while formerly conservative. He added that, however socialistic many legislators are, the pressure from their districts is even more to the left in terms of practical demands. Even people who cry for lower taxes demand more benefits and subsidies, all of which means more statism. Statism is thus the religion and the morality of most men. The state, however, is also very weak today in that it is a god that fails people, and its more brilliant sons are savagely at war with it because of its failures. They demand all things from the state and then turn on it savagely as a Baal that has failed them. Their morality and faith is still statist, but it is deeply infected with bitterness and despair. Force rules history, but that ruling force is moral and religious force and conviction. The letters of Junius held otherwise. The letters spoke of the first original right of the people from which all laws derive their authority, and also of tradition as authority. One precedent creates another. They soon accumulate and constitute a law. What yesterday was fact, today is doctrine. But men overthrow both precedent and, quote, original right, end quote, when it violates their moral convictions, so this view is superficial. Men find their basic and ultimate authority in what they hold to be truth. The modern age being a humanistic one, men have sought for truth on the human and temporal level, and the state has thus come to be the basic institution for them. Humanistic man believes that the state is the way to the good life. The state is the final authority over men, and the state is the supreme court in all things. Not surprisingly, the courts of the states have increasingly become lawmakers, because the standard for legality is man and the fullness of life for man. If capital punishment limits man's life, then capital punishment must be ruled unlawful. If war limits man's life, then war must be challenged in the courts. If men have a right to good food, housing, clothing, and all things else, whether or not they work for them, then the courts must and will establish men's rights to these things. The courts are keeping pace with the religious beliefs of modern man. In view of our humanism, it is not surprising that constitutionalism is virtually dead. Even the conservative defenders of the Constitution want the results of it, without the Christian presuppositions and faith which undergird it. As Drucker points out, Constitutionalism is much more than a respect for law. It is a belief that power, to be beneficial, must be subject to general and unchangeable rules. It is an assertion that ends and means cannot be meaningfully separated or considered apart from each other. Peter F. Drucker, Men, Ideas and Politics, New York, New York, Harper and Row, 1971, page 175. Constitutionalism rests on a belief that the sovereign God has an absolute law order to which every human order must relate itself. See Edward S. Corwin, The Higher Law, Background of American Constitutional Law, Ithaca, New York, Cornell University Press, 1955. The essence of humanistic law is that, instead of relating social order to God's absolute law, society must relate law to human needs. This belief is the moral force behind the modern state and the source of its authority. The failure of humanistic authority is that it is essentially totalitarian and/or anarchistic. If the people are the source of authority, then we must either wind up in a dictatorship, in which the general will or the consensus finds its incarnation in a leader, an elite, or a party, or in anarchism, in which all men as gods do each their, quote, own thing, end quote. There was a drift in both directions today. The basic decisions by states in the second half of the 20th century have been made outside the normal legislative channels. Thus, in the United States, the basic and most important decisions have not been made by Congress and the normal political process, as Drucker has pointed out. In domestic politics, the basic decisions with respect to school segregation and reapportionment were not made by Congress, but by the Supreme Court. These decisions, while opposed by many, met favour with many, and they were in line with the basic liberal, humanistic faith of church, school and people. The opposition to these measures has also depended largely on non-political protest. The legislative branches of, quote, democratic, end quote, civil government have not been the primary means of opposition. Again, in foreign affairs, the United States committed itself to two major wars, in Korea and then in Vietnam, without any legislative action. These commitments were aspects of a humanistic and messianic save-the-world faith, and they were made by Truman and Kennedy, heroes of liberal humanism. The opposition, however, which has developed towards the Vietnam War, is also grounded in humanism, and this opposition has bypassed state means increasingly for direct action and pressure. Thus, while faith in the state remains, there is an increasing breakdown in the authority of the state because its moral foundations are crumbling. The decline in law enforcement and the rise of lawlessness is a symptom of the breakdown. What many people forget is that law enforcement is not basically a police and court affair, but a moral concern. Most laws cannot be enforced unless they are first of all enforced by the moral conscience of the people. No state, however dictatorial, can enforce a law which is radically at odds with the conscience of its people. Before a revolution can occur in the political realm, it must be preceded by a revolution in the religious and moral sphere. Before the French Revolution could occur, a religious and moral decline and collapse had sapped the life of France. The Russian Revolution was preceded by a widespread decline of vital faith and a growing humanism. The people in the Soviet Union have widespread discontents, but most of them are morally in agreement with their regime and thus lack the moral force which is the forerunner and mainspring of change. The modern state, thus, has great power but a declining authority. In this, it resembles the regimes of kings like Charles I and James II of England. Power without moral authority. In each case, a prelude to ruin. In William Langland's poem, Piers Plowman, the angel declares to the clergy and king of the late 14th century, "King and prince art thou, tomorrow nothing." The moral force was gone from the social order, and the result was a long era of revolution and civil war, when men who had power today, tomorrow had nothing. Langland's answers were, unfortunately, too much like those of the royalty and nobility of his day, and his earnest hope for a new order was frustrated. His answer was, quote, "charity," end quote, and a bold and heedless following of Christ. In this, he echoed the virtues prized by the upper class of his day, the very men who were destroying England. For them, virtue meant, quote, "a prodigal generosity, largesse, and the quality of being physically rash, outrageous." Gervase Matthew, The Court of Richard II, New York, New York, Norton, 1968, page 22. In this impotence, Langland is followed by the youth of our day, who echo the statist principles and humanism they are supposedly rebelling against. The only moral force which can undercut the power of statism is a biblical faith in the sovereign and triune God and his absolute law word. God said of all the nations of Isaiah's day, and of all history, that they are, quote, "nothing," end quote, in his sight. Isaiah chapter 40, verses 23 and 24. "Behold, the nations are as a drop of a bucket, and are counted as the small dust of the balance. Behold, he taketh up the isles as a very little thing." Isaiah chapter 40, verse 15. As long as men believe that salvation comes by the state, its politicians and leaders, and by the laws of the state, they will give the power of a god to the state, and the moral force of a god as well. In our day, both conservatives and leftists are at odds with the state, and often at war with it. But both are agreed in seeing it as their saviour, and they concentrate their energies on statist action and control as the key to salvation. They want to capture the state machinery, such as its socialistic schools, rather than to establish independent and Christian schools. However angry they may be at the state, and rebellious against its authority, they will bow down before the state as their God and Saviour until they turn to their true Lord and God and serve Him only. The state will shrink to its proper place only when men give God His due priority and authority. There is no other way. The power of the states will not be broken by lawless rebellion, but by godly faith. As Sister M. Margaret P. McCarran observed recently, Christ came into a world that was exactly the same kind of mess. He honoured legitimate authority, no matter how evil its bearer. He lived peaceably in the world of real people for 30 years, in spite of revolutions, overtaxation, aggressor nations, and surrounding paganism. Our era is not a mere repetition of a historical pattern. It is the same pattern. However, our Lord said, "I have overcome the world." He is still saying it. It is still the same world. Letter, December the 7th, 1971. The world has always been ruled by religious and moral force. The issue is between the moral forces of humanism and Christianity. You have your choice. Are you a part of the problem or a part in the victory?